Good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna wait just a couple more minutes. We got a few more people jumping on. List keeps coming up. I did see one participant had a hand raised. If you want to just put your question into the chat, it's probably the easiest way. We can hopefully help you out if you have questions.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Creating Affordable Housing Through Faith-Based Partnerships. I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will eventually be available on YouTube for future reference. So first, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Detlev Peikert. People call me Detty, D-E-T-T-Y. I'm a principal and architect with RRM Design Group. I've been practicing architecture in Santa Barbara in Southern California for about 42 years, and I specialize in the design and the development of affordable housing. And RRM Design Group, hosting this webinar, is a multidisciplinary design firm with offices throughout California. So the video you were just watching as you entered the webinar was a virtual tour of a senior housing project developed by National Core, National Community Renaissance, in partnership with the Church of the Blessed Sacrament in Placentia, California. And I'm very happy to say that the project just had its grand opening on Monday. So it's fully complete, and I believe it's pretty much fully occupied and spoken for, with a long waiting list already, which underscores the need for affordable housing, as you can imagine. So for this webinar, we've got a really great panel of experts in faith-based partnerships. And to kick things off, I'd like to invite each of our guest panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Elijah Pierce.
Good afternoon. My name is Elijah Pierce. I am an architect and principal at RRM Design Group. I've been working in the affordable housing arena for about the last 10 years, working on a number of different affordable housing project types: senior, veterans, permanent supportive housing, and large family housing. It's something that I got into as a young architect, and I've loved the type of projects that we get to do. So really excited to share a little bit about what we've been able to do when partnering with faith-based organizations today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Blackburn. I am also with RM Design Group as a principal planner. I have worked in both the public and private sectors for almost 20 years. My public experience has been at both the city and county agency levels, and on the private side, I previously did work in an all-in-one development, construction, and property management company. So with that background, I tend to view development process through the lens of the eventual operations and how the front end of design and development contributes to the programming goals of the operator or property manager. And I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you. Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Walker. I'm a senior project manager with National Community Renaissance. We are a nonprofit affordable housing developer that's based in Rancho Cucamonga. We have about 10,000 units around all over Southern California. I've been with National Core for about 10 years now, and I'm working on actually my 6th partnership projects with churches. We started this effort kind of back in 2017, so excited to be here.
Thank you, Sarah. So there you have it. This is a great, I'm sorry, Reverend Bell.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm Michael Bell. I'm a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, not to presume who's on the call and if they know that terminology, but that's a geographic area encompassing 6 counties in Southern California, representing about 133 churches. And I work for an allied group called Episcopal Communities and Services that is assisting the diocese in developing affordable housing on up to 1/4 of our church properties, 25% of those properties across those 6 counties. Aspirationally, we want to host affordable housing. And CORE is one of our trusted development partners. I'm glad to see Sarah here.
Thank you so much. And thank you for participating as a panelist in this webinar today. We really appreciate that. So I'm just going to briefly go over the agenda with you so you know what to expect going forward here. And first of all, we're going to be talking about the housing crisis. And I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the state declared a housing crisis in California, where millions of our residents are affected by the high cost of housing and the lack of availability of housing. And so that's one of the first things we're going to be talking about today. And then we're going to go on to the role of faith-based institutions in the opportunity to develop affordable housing, or to be partners with developers to create affordable housing. I think you'll see that there's some amazing opportunities ahead in that possibility. And then we want to get into developing affordable housing. What's involved, partnering with the developer and the process and all that's involved in actually making a project like the one you saw in the video a reality. And then we'll move on to community engagement, talking about how we engage the community, both of the faith-based institution, church, or otherwise, and of course the community surrounding where these developments are being built. And then, and this is super important and one of the catalysts for this webinar, and that is the fact that the state recently adopted some new legislation referred to as SB4, which makes it possible for churches and other faith-based institutions to use excess land that they may have to make it available to develop housing without having to go through all of the difficulties involved typically in developing housing, such as rezoning and general plan amendments and all of those kinds of things. So I think you're going to find that part very interesting. And finally, or not finally, but we want to talk about design and what's involved in the design process and how we engage the faith-based community in the process, and what some of the key design elements are. And then, of course, the construction process, and that's a really important aspect of it, is how does the construction kind of interface with an existing church or other institutions. So I think that's going to be very interesting. And And then finally, after these presentations, we're going to get into a period of questions and answers. And you'll see that there's a chat button there. When you push that, you can type in your questions, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the seminar. And of course, if we miss some questions, we'll always have an opportunity to follow up afterwards with any of you who want to get more information, etc. All right, so let's kick it off with the housing crisis. Elijah?
Great, thank you, Deddy. So we wanted to start this with kind of asking the big questions of why are we talking about affordable housing when they say there's a housing crisis? What's that mean? And why is it worth it to look into doing something as complex and lengthy as developing affordable housing? So I wanted to take a moment and just touch on this a little. I think the housing crisis is something that affects all of us. So I imagine most of you are familiar with the general impact, but it is really striking once you look into how it's affecting all of us, particularly in California. So, it's not just houses. The cost of housing is driving up the poverty rate. Once you include the cost of housing into the poverty numbers, California jumps to the top of the list out of the whole country, which is, it was very shocking to me to see, oh, wow, that's when you factor in those housing costs, it puts us at the top or the bottom of the list, depending on how you look at it. Similarly, it's driving the highest rates and actual totals of homelessness in the state, out of any state in the country. But the crisis doesn't affect just those at the lower end of the income spectrum. It's really affecting all the demographics of our state. So it's putting huge financial pressure on everyone that's being affected by that housing. So renters are behind. We've got 30% of renters in California paying more than half their income just to rent. So that affects everything about our economy, just for everyone. So this is not an isolated crisis. It's something that's really affecting the broad swath of everyone in California. And wanted to touch a little on how did we get here? Because I think it informs why we think that affordable housing has such a large role to play in the solution. And housing is an extremely complex system of lots of cause effects and factors that bake into it. But if you have to really crystallize it down to a few key elements, it's not all that complicated. We didn't build enough housing over the last several decades in California. We just did not keep up with the demographics of our state and build a lot less housing than we needed. Once that happened, you hit kind of a supply-demand crux and housing prices soared. And once those prices soared, you see all the effects that we just spoke about. So this is I thought an interesting chart. Basically, different estimates from housing experts across California of the number of units that they estimated we needed to build to maintain our levels of affordability. And so those horizontal colored lines are the different estimates. And there's a good range of them. But over the last few decades, they're all much higher than the actual how many units we've built. So we're underbuilding, in the range of 100,000 units per year, just to keep up with the level of housing that we once had. So that's a big miss. And so since the 80s, we've just not been hitting our housing building requirements. What's that do? So it does this, that this chart, this is LA County indexing for the 60s. The income, so average income is now up to around 92, but look at that median house value. And so in a nutshell, that gap between income and value of the housing, that's the housing crisis right there. Again, this is LA County, but the stats look similar for most counties in California. You've just had this ever increasing gap between income and housing, and it hurts everyone. And when you get these big jumps in housing costs, it has all sorts of negative effects across our economy and our society. So things like inequality, the inequality that we have gets exacerbated. That's made worse. So those that are already behind, not having safe and stable housing, puts them even further behind. It drops home ownership rates. We're seeing the lowest home ownership rates since the 1940s. And then, of course, you see a huge surge in homelessness. So what's needed? And we'll be talking about this, at length today. But we'd like to make the case that what we need is more housing, and faith-based institutions have a unique opportunity now to help out with that effort. Particularly with the new legislation, there's some new avenues that make this a really viable route for faith-based organizations to lend a hand in this effort to provide more housing for our communities. So really excited to talk more about this. I will hand it over to Reverend Bell to talk a little bit about what that partnership looks like from a faith-based perspective.
Thank you, Elijah. I realize on this Zoom, there's probably developers as well as faith community people listening and participating. And particularly to the faith community people, I want to acknowledge that this is going to be a lot of information coming at you today. And if you're not familiar with it, it can feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, and it's a lot to absorb. So you can watch the video later, and certainly in the Q&A, pick up some more clarification questions. Also, I'm coming from a particular type of faith community that's structured in a particular way that has both some advantages and some disadvantages to how we work. So when I talk about some of the ways we've approached this, I recognize it might be different for you in your context, and we can certainly cover some of that in the Q&A. At the top, why would a faith community want to create affordable housing? I would say at one point, we are seen as one of the largest holders of land, titled land in our area. Faith communities have been identified as the stewards of a great deal of land. And we should, I believe, ask ourselves, what in the name of God or the divine are we doing with this land that's been entrusted to us today for the benefit of all of our neighbors now, as well as for the generations to come? In addition to what we're already doing, many of us have parcels of land or parts of our properties that might be underutilized that could be put to use to benefit the community. And affordable housing may in fact be one of the ways to do that, depending on your circumstances. The other thing I would say is when we ask ourselves as faith communities, what is the highest and best use of the property that we've been entrusted with? A traditional answer is, well, make the most money possible. When you ask many people that question, highest and best use, we need to ask ourselves, what is the highest and best use in context of the mission and ministry we have to serve our neighbors in a way that we believe is sacred or holy? Finally, a bit of context, I would say that in our case, in the Episcopal Church, in our diocese, we really have to ask ourselves the question in our local congregations, do we fundamentally believe that we're all better off commonweal wise if we're in mutual support of our neighbors, and if we're seeking to repair some of the fissures in our fabric, the things that have separated us from one another, biases, economics, redlining, biases in financing, life circumstance? Do we fundamentally believe that we're called to help repair those relationships and bring people back together in common life? And if the answer is yes, and we see that hosting affordable housing could work toward that vision, it helps propel us through the challenges that we're going to talk about today of getting that going. Ultimately, in our case, we believe that's part of our sacred responsibility, our divine mandate, is to, again, utilize what's been entrusted to us to serve the needs of today, of our neighbors, as well as several generations to come. On a practical level, if you're a leader of your faith community, I would offer to you that when you begin this sort of endeavor, even just exploring the concept of affordable housing, it can be a way to energize your congregation toward a new sense of purpose and mission in your community. It can change the perception of your neighbors and what they think of the church and how relevant you are these days to the community and meeting the current needs of the community. On a practical level, it can also generate supplemental revenue to support your mission and ministry through the use of land leases. And it ultimately can be a legacy that you and your neighbors and your partners leave for the generations to come. You made a difference now that will benefit probably 2 or 3 generations to come. So those are some of the whys behind it. I was also asked to address why would a faith community want to partner with an affordable housing developer versus other partners that might come towards you as a church offering to help you develop your land. I will say, I won't talk a lot about the commercial and market rate developers that might seek you out. We can talk about that a little bit later. But when we look at nonprofit affordable housing developers like National Cord, who's on the line with us, their mission is aligned with ours as a nonprofit community benefit organization. So that's probably one. 2, when you work with the trusted and the right partner, affordable housing developer, they carry a lot of the work that otherwise would be yours to try to figure out on your own. They bring expertise, they bring financial backing, the know-how to really drive the process with you so that you're not having to figure all that out on your own. And with a experienced nonprofit affordable housing developer, you will get also the benefits of anticipatory problem solving and community engagement. And if they're maybe the right partner for you, the ability to handle some of the unexpected things that come up. So what would you look for in a development partner? And there we can talk later about how you even find one. But I would start by saying keywords: trust, communication, courage, and commitment. I liken this when I'm talking to our church leaders like dating, courting, premarital work, and marriage, that ultimately you need to trust this potential partner. You need to feel that there's mutual courageousness in communicating all the realities, all the hopes and dreams, all the potential challenges. You're not afraid to bring the tough issues up. And you sense a mutual commitment to making this work for the neighbors. So if your partner is the right one, you'll sense that trust, open communication, sense of courage and commitment to it. And like with courting, dating, engagement, and marriage, I would say that a good development partner is going to just feel better and better through each of those stages of increasing depth of commitment. You can start by going out with a number of potential development partners and learning about them, but eventually you're going to start sensing that there's chemistry, if you will, between a potential partner that seems to really understand your particular community needs and your aspirations in your faith community. And they're asking you really insightful questions, and you're starting to realize their interests are aligned with yours. And when you start moving from that into the more commitment stage, the engagement stage, if you will, before marriage, you'll find that they are transparent with you about finances and about issues that are going to come up with the city and the local area. And they're not just holding your hand, but really partnering with you. You begin to see evidence of that. Those are signs that that's a good development partner. On paper, even before you talk to them, some of the things we look for: what's their reputation in the community? Do they have experience in similar contexts to yours in developing affordable housing? Do they have the financial backing and strength to handle the unexpected things that come up in the multi-year process? Are they well-known and likely to be competitively advantaged when going after money that everyone's trying to get? Are they likely to have a competitive bid for some of that subsidy funding? Those are some of the things that we look for when we're looking at particular development partners in our case. In terms of the financial terms, we can get into more detail in the Q&A, but I highlight we begin in our community with an idea that we're going to lease the land long-term, 60, 70, 90 years, We're not selling it, we're leasing it to the development partner to build a business to run affordable housing for, again, decades to come. And in some cases, when you're navigating that with your partner, if you've done your homework and you have a better understanding of what might be feasible on your property or what it's worth in the market, that's a good starting place of conversation with your partner who can help you further define that and operationalize that. You will come into discussion over what the terms of a land lease might look like, and a good trustworthy partner is going to help you see the trade-offs between more land lease income versus more enhancements to the housing community itself, and be realistic with you about how much you need out of this and how much can go back into the housing development community itself. And lastly, I would say that in some cases, you might be able to get a significant advance of capital upfront so that you can meet immediate needs in your church community. Maybe you're facing some challenges with maintenance needs or personnel or what have you. A good partner can help you identify, can they afford you some money upfront and then adjust the land lease payments going forward differently. If you don't need that kind of capital upfront, that's really helpful to the development partner because they can stretch out their financing and amortize that differently. All of this should be talked about early and often, and it will be iterated over the first year or two sometimes before you really have a firm sense of what the terms look like. I would emphasize in this case, I like to say to our churches, don't chase the dollar. Don't be driven by what you think you're going to get out of it financially. Let that be a supplement to you realizing the vision that you've defined for your congregation in the neighborhood. The supplement income will help, but it shouldn't drive the process. When it drives the process, other issues and obstacles and nerves start getting worked, I think, in that process. We can get more into the details of negotiating financial terms during the Q&A if you'd like. In terms of what would you do if you're interested in this? What are some of the next steps and maybe some of the initial caveats or warnings that I would offer you from a religious leader standpoint? First of all, don't jump at the first offer that comes to you unsolicited from potential ventures or businesses with agendas or missions that are not closely aligned with yours. Right now, because of the laws that have been enacted, there are a lot of opportunistic developers out there proactively reaching out to church communities with deals that sound a little too good to be true. And I would rely on the common wisdom that says if it sounds too good to be true, that probably is. And they're unfortunately preying on more naive and anxious churches, promising a lot of money and they can take the problem off your hands. I would say take a step back. First, go talk to some of your peers or other people who have done this sort of work if you know them and get some insight from them. There you can look online or we can give you referrals to a number of both nonprofit groups as well as fee-for-service consultancies that can come in with your specific interests in mind and help you understand a little bit more about what might be possible and how things work. There are a number of websites now that you can go to get self-help and asynchronous learning where you can download information and kind of learn for yourself. Educate, explore, and engage, I guess I would say. Educate yourself, explore some of the options, and engage with some peers even before you go reaching out to a development partner. That said, some of the trustworthy development partners can do some of this work with and for you and not charge you a dime to do it because it's in their interest in this being successful as well. And some of the more trustworthy partners will do that with you and on your behalf, but it's good to have a little of that preparation up front before you engage them if you can.
Thank you, Reverend Bell. I know there's a lot of wisdom in what you've been telling us and talking about, and really appreciate that. But let's look now at what does it actually take to do a development like this in one of these partnerships. And we have Sarah Walker who's going to walk us through that process.
All right, thank you. And when I was asked to do this and they asked me to talk about the development process, I said, how long is this webinar going to go? Because it's obviously a very complicated and lengthy process. So I am going to kind of give a high level summary today of kind of what it takes. And I wanted to kind of start too by sharing why National Core has kind of been pursuing and looking at these different opportunities to develop on faith land. And that is largely because it does allow us to actually build in areas where we weren't able to before. And a lot of these areas are higher resource areas with really good schools, access to jobs, which gives our residents the best chance of success in order to kind of break that cycle of poverty. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of just give a high level overview. There are kind of 4 basic phases to the development process that National Core kind of sees. And I don't know, Amanda, if you can actually have the, thank you. So we see, you have kind of this outreach and conceptual design stage. It leads to entitlements, and then financing. Ultimately, once you're financed, you get to build it, and it ends in a grand opening. And as you can see, this, by this timeline, this is in kind of a best case scenario, roughly 4 years. However, I would caution that most of the time it takes a lot longer. So as you heard from Duddy, we had, it was very exciting. We had our grand opening of Santa Angelina and Placentia on Monday, and I started working with Duddy and Michael Bell's predecessor at ECS back in 2017 on that development. This first phase of outreach and conceptual design is really critical in my mind. It sets the tone for the partnership, and honestly, in my mind, it's actually the most fun. It can last anywhere from 6 to 12 months, and it's really about looking at the property and kind of developing that trust and that relationship and kind of that vision for what the church wants to do and what can actually be done, what can be financed on the property. So, this phase includes meeting regularly with the church leadership. We often have weekly meetings to check in. We meet regularly with the design team. We start talking to the city, and we start talking to the neighbors as well as stakeholders and other community groups, and really start building support for affordable housing. The end result being a design that's ideally compatible with the church property, as well as the neighborhood, but that can also be financed. And so once we have that design, we submit it to the city for formal entitlement approval. And this is where SB4, which Linda is going to share a little bit more about later, historically, as if this particular, I put 6 months for entitlements. We have actually seen this stage take 2.5 to 3 years in the past prior to SB4. So it's exciting that this is passed, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. So once we're approved by the city, we can start applying for financing. I put 12 plus months. In the best case scenario, we can apply for financing, but it's important to kind of understand that there's very limited sources available, and that the applications are only accepted a few times a year. So it's hard. If you miss that deadline, you have to kind of wait a long period of time, or if you don't get financed in that round, you have to wait. So construction, once you have your financing, is typically 18 to 24 months. It varies depending on how big the building is or how complicated the construction types are. We at National Core is a general contractor, so we stay involved from start to finish, which kind of gives us a little bit more control. But the good news is it won't extend beyond that, because most of the funding sources, you have to be done with construction within a certain amount of time. So, and then at the end, you have this beautiful grand opening, which is very exciting. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kind of financing aspects of this. So a really important part of affordable housing that really drives a lot of things, the schedule, the design, is, ensuring that there is money to pay to build the development. So there are kind of 3 levels of funding that are often layered together in order to fund a community. And this typically involves state money like tax credits and housing program funding, federal money, which can be things like project-based vouchers, or it could be other money like home funds or CDBG funds that are allocated by the Department of Housing, the Federal Department of Housing. And then really what's become most valuable is local money from cities, the county, or a local housing trust, which are often used as leverage in order to get these larger sources. So for National Core, as a larger kind of nonprofit, We tend to use tax credits as our primary source of funding, and they are a competitive funding source. They typically are awarded about twice a year for 9% and 3 times a year for 4%. And so when we're kind of designing a project, we have to kind of meet a minimum number of units in order to kind of make it feasible. And so really what we are often looking for is projects that are around 50 units or so in total. And then we also have to look at the target populations. A lot of these funding sources are really starting to be geared towards certain groups of people. And so I know a lot of times when you're looking at your property or your neighborhood that your land is located, you may have a certain group of individuals or families, seniors that you want to house. And this is where it does get a little bit, the funding really does tend to drive the target population. So in the last 3 to 5 years, many of the funding sources have been prioritizing households with the greatest level of need. And so this has included extremely low income families that are making below 30% of the area median income. It also has included almost all of our projects at this point have at least a small percentage of permanent supportive housing units, which are typically units that the county or local agency is placing individuals that are homeless or have experienced homelessness into those units. And I did want to just notate that I know there is, we run into this in many different communities that people aren't sure about what permanent supportive housing is. And there's been a lot of education around this, but it generally, there is still screening, there are still rules, that people have to follow, and there is screening that happens in order to determine who is allowed to live in there. For example, you can't have a criminal history to live in or a violent criminal history in order to live in the unit. As I just mentioned, in order to kind of, due to the location of many of the religious sites that we have been looking at, we found that engaging the community is not only beneficial to the development, but it honestly is really necessary. There's a lot of education there's a lot of misinformation out there about affordable housing. So it can literally be kind of the key to success or failure of a development. So over the years, we found that developing affordable housing really benefits when there's outreach and education through kind of a multi-tiered public participation program. And so this typically includes things like community meetings. We reach out often to stakeholder groups. So that could be like a local a pro-housing group. It could be the behavioral health. It could be any sort of, it could be a Democratic club. It could be a number of different organizations that are working within a city, and we tend to partner with them. Oftentimes, we actually do reach out to faith-based organizations prior to even working with faith-based organizations. We often partnered with churches and asked for their support on our developments. So, with a public participation plan, we're often holding larger public community meetings in order to allow people to come and ask questions and get answers, get information. We have kind of these smaller stakeholder roundtables. Sometimes we'll go out knocking door to door and talk to the neighbors and try to make sure that they're aware of things that we're doing. So because a lot of faith-based land is located in single-family neighborhoods, there can be a number of community concerns. It can be everything from parking or loss of privacy to misinformed beliefs about lower-income households. The most successful developments that I've worked on were ones where we worked really closely with the church leadership and even the congregation at times to do the outreach and the design together to really make sure that all the voices were being heard. And then for the kind of church leadership and even the congregation to be part of sharing that vision and to get to kind of go out and, tell people what you're wanting to do with your land. And I just, this process, I've kind of described it to many people. It's just really honestly a series of mini miracles. Getting these housing developments actually built and open and having people move in. It's just so exciting, but it really is just, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time, and it's very exciting. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions at the end once we're done with the presentation.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. Now we're going to talk about the core of what I think is a real great incentive for churches to look carefully at this, and that is the new legislation As you know, the state's been passing a lot of laws to incentivize the construction of housing and to remove roadblocks. And in the context of this webinar and the possibility for church partnerships with developers, this law SB4 goes a long way, and Linda's going to talk about that right now.
Thank you, Dedy. So I'm a bit of a metaphor person. There's a lot of information, as Reverend Bell mentioned. So I think it's akin to baking a pie. We're all providing information on what are the ingredients, what should it look like at the end of this, what is the recipe, this is how you put it together, and eventually Dedy's going to close it out with some case studies of what it looks like at the end and how we got here. This is just a little sliver, as Dedy mentioned, of resources we have available to us to go ahead and streamline that process, make it quicker, easier, tips and tricks of how to put it together. So what is Senate Bill 4? It's a new legislation, as Dedy mentioned, that passed January, or went into effect January 1st of this year. And it allows for housing development projects to be a use by right on property held by religious institutions. I will say that it does also apply to independent institutions of higher education, but for today's purposes, the focus will be on religious institutions. Slide. So SB4 is also known as the Affordable Housing on Faith Lands Act, rather than just an acronym and a numeral, which is what a lot of legislation is these days. It gets its own name. So it's known as the Affordable Housing on Faith Lands Act. But it has also been dubbed Yes in God's Backyard.
I like that.
So what are the benefits and opportunities that this bill brings? One has to do with CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. And this is a process that, can take anywhere from 10 days to, 2 years, sometimes even longer. But what SB4 does is, by defining this process of if you meet certain requirements, that it would be a ministerial approval, and ministerial approval projects are not required to have environmental review through CEQA. I will caveat that by saying that the actual legislation does require and have, language that relates to, being on a hazardous waste site or being in a floodway or, things of that nature. So it's already built into the language, but it provides for that opportunity to bypass that somewhat lengthy process as part of entitlements. And as far as the ministerial approval, a use by right means that a development project doesn't have to go through a discretionary review. And it's not to say that it doesn't go to hearing bodies, but there can't be any sort of discretion with that approval process, such as if you have like community input, where, people don't want this near their house, or if you have political sway, that doesn't play into the process and doesn't get factored into here. So they've allowed it so that that's not going to be something that the project would be subject to. As far as streamlining, this relates to what Sarah was mentioning earlier about those extended timeframes to entitle a project. As she mentioned, she put on there 6 months, and it can range to 2 years. But one of the key benefits to this new legislation is removing some of those regulatory barriers in an already challenging and extensive process. For example, there are zones and some zones, like commercial zones, don't allow for residential development. If it doesn't allow for the residential development, there's a process that would need to be pursued, which is the general plan zoning amendment type of process, which adds on to the already lengthy process. SB4 allows for residential housing even on lands that are not zoned for it, again, within certain parameters. But that takes a huge chunk of time off of processing these things. So it removes that particular barrier. As far as an additional streamlining component to this is that it does require that the local agency or local government process the project in certain timeframes. there can be many rounds of reviews, and the reviews can last over 30 days, and it can be turned out many times. And the provisions within this legislation does have requirements of tight timeframes with which the local government has to adhere to. So that is helpful as well. As far as it relates to density, for parcels not zoned residential, you're allowed up to 40 units an acre, which is 40 units more than you would get if you didn't have this, and if you had to go through the general plan amendment zone change process. If it is in a residential zone, multifamily or single family, you're eligible for additional density bonuses on top of what's already allowed in that zone. There are also reduced parking provisions, and if you're near a transit area, and that allows you to have a higher density and higher ability to provide more of the much needed housing. Go to the next one. Great. So what's the catch? There are caveats. I will say that I'm not going to, I don't want to say the exhaustive list, but there are some fine print asterisks. And some of those are that the land needs to be purchased or owned prior to January 1st, 2024 this year. This would not apply to newly acquired land. So that's one thing to consider if, that looking at maybe some other properties, this is specifically for those lands that are already in the ownership of the religious institution. The development or the housing units would need to be 100% affordable. Now, that the affordability levels can range, but no more than 20% moderate based upon area median income that is set by the local jurisdiction or county. And then also it excludes managers units. So there are provisions to, accommodate for the maintenance of the property. There are also proximity limits to industrial uses or mining activities that relates back into the environmental review. But the labor requirements, these are a little bit, as Debbie mentioned, there are a lot of new legislation and laws that have recently passed, and these labor requirements are a little bit more specific in that, one, that the prevailing wage rates would be required on projects that are over 10 homes or units. And if there are 50 homes or units or more, contractors would actually be required to offer apprentices employment and pay for health care or otherwise, insurance. In addition, there are monthly reporting requirements. So those are, some of the constraints, but overall, SB 4 is a step forward for affordable housing opportunities through faith-based partnerships. And there are many benefits and opportunities that outweigh those considerations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Elijah.
Yeah, thanks very much, Linda. Clearly we can see that there are benefits from this, and I think it was a very special thing that the legislature kind of looked at this and saw these opportunities and decided to create a law that would facilitate this to a greater extent than had been possible before. So I think that's really great. But now we're going to talk about the thing that we as architects love the most. We love designing things and then seeing them ultimately built and providing housing that's needed for the people. And so Elijah's going to walk you through that whole process right through.
Thank you, Diddy. So there's a lot that goes into designing a project, millions of factors and things to be concerned about. Today, though, we wanted to really focus on some of the things that make a project on faith lands unique from other projects. So some kind of big picture, top level things that we found really need to be taken into consideration when developing these type of projects. So this is not a picture of our average site. It is really, really rare that you run across a site with affordable housing that is in a broad open field. You're much more likely to have it embedded within a community. And in a lot of ways, I think that's a great thing, but it does create a lot more complexity, a lot more items that you really want to start looking at with your design team, with your architect, from a very early stage in the concept. So when thinking about privacy and community, those are both good things, and they're not mutually exclusive, but you do want to find a way to balance them. So some of the first things are the views from the community, that very often with an existing site, you want to make sure that the new development doesn't necessarily hide or obscure your existing buildings. If you're actively part of community, I think a religious organization would want to make sure that their buildings are visible and not tucked away behind an apartment complex. And so it's good to understand what are those key views that you want to make sure are protected in the design. And then similarly, the views from the sanctuary building to the apartments and back. When we design an apartment complex, for instance, we try never to put two apartments across a hallway with the doors directly across from one another. It just creates that chance moment where, early Sunday morning, you open up the door and you're looking right in somebody else's eyes, and they open up the door and you see into their kitchen. You don't do those alignments because you want to give everybody that little bit of separation. And so something similar to that happens with these type of developments, where when you open the doors of your sanctuary, you don't want to be looking into someone's bedroom, and vice versa. So how can you set it up to make sure those views back and forth are things that you want rather than things you don't want? How to align and take care of those? And that level of nuance really requires great communication between you and your design team. They've got to understand, okay, yes, here's the main front door, but really everybody exits out the side, or making sure they really understand how the existing buildings are used and what those kind of key views are. Then similarly, both the apartment building and the church are likely to have community areas. How do you make sure those are interacting in a way that you want? Sometimes that might be separating them out. Sometimes you might want a community area that can actually share or serve both spaces. Another key area about a key aspect of this is understanding the sacred spaces. And by that, I mean not just the sanctuary. So what on the existing site do you and your congregation deem sacred? Those might be trees or natural features, certain views that you absolutely hold dear, that these really cannot be crossed over. It might be where you have coffee and donuts after a service, and that is such a critical part of your community's community. They say, no, we can't put parking there. Absolutely not. These things need to be communicated and really made sure that everyone on the design team understands them. And then another key aspect of this is that both a religious organization and a apartment complex, they're not static items. Both will have their rhythms to them. And I think this is particularly important for religious organizations. There are often key days where there are their main services, there are special events, maybe they are a major wedding venue. So understanding how your property kind of ebbs and flows in terms of traffic, people coming and going. Maybe you have evening worships that are very popular on Wednesdays, and understanding that can really help inform the design. So it might just be how we approach lighting or how we approach access to make sure those things are considered. And then vice versa, as a religious organization, we'd recommend really understanding what sort of services are provided by the affordable housing development. That, yes, you're often people coming, going at work and school hours, but a lot of the developments we work with have secondary programs, so ESL classes or GED classes, after school programs. It's good to understand, oh, there actually are going to be a lot of people here on Thursday afternoons for this class. And so you understand how those different rhythms are going to interact, and then how the physical orientation of spaces can best support those. And then the actual architecture. We like to think of this as how can the architecture of the affordable housing complement the architecture of the sacred spaces? And complement is it's a very flexible word, because it can really mean a lot of things. We have some clients that want the new development to blend in seamlessly, whereas others want to separate it out, to clearly define, this is something different. They don't want people wandering into the apartment complex on Sunday mornings. No, this is not a place of worship. This is housing. Both are valid. There's no right or wrong answer here, but this is a key thing to come to an understanding with you and your congregation of how do you want these two to interact. So this is a complex that I thought took a nice balance from it, that some of the materials and massing was borrowed from the existing sanctuary building architecture. You have some similar massing, but at the same time, it's broken down to a very residential feel. So finding that balance is really key, and to have a good understanding of what direction do you want to start leaning towards. Do you want that differentiation? Do you want kind of that cohesive look? So looking at not only that cohesion or differentiation with the existing buildings, but also with the neighborhood. And if there are materials or massing that you particularly want to have brought into the apartment complex. So just a few key ideas, it's a long road, but they are things that we find the most successful developments really focus on pretty early on in the design stage, so we can make sure we're kind of on the right path. With that, I will hand it over to talk a little bit about construction and beyond.
Am I the one in this section? I thought you
sorry. So I think this is a tag team effort.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think Sarah might chime in as well.
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah. So if you've made it as far as you've gotten your financing and you're finally ready to kind of break ground with construction, it can feel like a lot, right? If you have a neighbor that's doing something on your street, sometimes that can feel like a lot. To be prepared for is, again, it's a lengthy process. So there's a lot of time to kind of communicate ahead of time and to kind of prepare for some of the changes that are going to be happening. In terms of the impacts on the neighborhood, it's going to be, there are going to be some temporary noise and some temporary dust that does occur during construction. I think the important thing that we found with the neighborhood, and in instances, we have a couple different developments where we've done different things. So we have some where the church went away entirely, and so maybe there was less of an impact on the faith organization. We've had instances where we've kind of developed on like a portion of the land away from where the existing church building was that was remaining. We also have the Santa Angelina development that Elijah was just showing, actually has buildings wrapping around a new parish hall and their existing sanctuary. And so in that instance, there was a lot of work that was done collaborating between the development team and the church to really get that ready. So I think, you know, with construction impacts, you do have to kind of be aware that there will be temporary noise and there will be temporary impacts in terms of dust or things going on around you. But the key is really making sure, again, that you have that kind of open line of communication with the development team. For example, with National Core, we kind of appoint a lead superintendent. And so that individual is on site every day. And our partners know that they can go talk to that individual about what's going on, or if there's some sort of issue, there's a clear point of contact. So yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Diddy.
No, I was just going to add that particular project I was pretty involved in from the very beginning, and it was particularly complicated. And I was so impressed with National Core's construction team, as well as their project managers, et cetera, and working closely with the congregation to work out all of these logistical issues. For example, they had an active daycare center on site. So we needed to take special precautions to make sure that the kids were safe during that construction period. We had to totally replace and rebuild parking lots. We had to make sure that there was going to be adequate parking so the church and the daycare could continue operating while those construction processes took place. And so, but at the end of the day, it was very successful. I think everyone was happy with how it was all worked out. And whenever there was an issue of any kind, National Core and the construction team were immediately responsive to resolve the issue and make sure that everything, continued smoothly without any problems.
Yeah, and our goal is to really try to anticipate ahead of time as much as possible what we think is going to happen, what accommodations do we need to make? How do we make sure that this is as seamless as possible for everybody so that we don't have an issue that we have to stop construction for, and that, the faith-based organization, if they're needing to continue operations, that they're able to do so. So the goal is really just, again, kind of back to communication and just really planning ahead, really good planning. I did want to kind of note for National Core, again, we also are we do property management. So our goal when we're designing things and building things, we are staying on for the long haul. So we're not planning to turn it over to somebody else. We have staff that stays, that lives on the site to help manage the property. And, this can be really key because when if your church is remaining on the site and you then have these new homes there, you have new residents that are living there. And it's ideal to kind of have that point person again to be able to talk to if there were to be an issue or if there are operational challenges that need to be discussed. I think it can be an added benefit. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind when you're looking, to potentially work with a development partner to kind of really ask those questions about what does it look like, who manages the property? Do you have somebody living there? These are good questions to kind of ask them as well.
So we're now complete with our presentation. I thought it was just really fantastic. Thank you, all panelists who have just done a great job in explaining the whole process. And from that, you can really see that there's some amazing opportunities here in terms of, working with an organization like National Core, a nonprofit that can build the housing and that can bring the resources to bear. In conjunction with SB4, the process is made that much easier. And so again, I just say there's some great opportunities here. I would encourage you, if you have questions, to type them into the chat, and I'm beginning to see some questions here. Yeah, and I was going to maybe start off by asking the Reverend Bell, if you can talk a little bit about the decision-making hierarchy within the church organization such as the Santa Angelina Church? And what's the process for getting decisions made with respect to the details of a partnership and all of that's involved with that?
Sure, and that's going to be different depending on the faith community's structure. So in the Episcopal Church, the way we're structured, it's kind of a blend of local congregational decision-making and then larger regional checks and balances and a consent process. So when we're working with our specific church congregations, first we want them to come to a place of coalesced buy-in and vision locally in that congregation, preferably in communication with some of their neighbors and their critical opinion leaders in the neighborhood. But that in our congregations, you'll have a leadership team, a council called a vestry. They need to be very much in agreement and on board. And then your key leaders within the congregation need to be on board. And what I say is if there are people with fears and concerns at that level, let's raise those and get them documented, because often that's going to be echoed in a larger community when we engage the larger community. So let's work on those things now. Once the local congregation believes this is something we want to do, we enter the more formal exploratory stage with potential developers. And in order to offer a potential developer the right, if you will, or exclusive right for a short term to work with our property at the exclusion of other opportunities, we have to get consent from several governance groups in the larger diocese. And I help facilitate that. And what they're looking for is financial implications, consistency with the mission and ethos of the church, etc. If we move through all that and get to a point of saying we want to work with this developer and give them the control, what's called site control, so that they can begin fund development, capital development, and the entitlement process with the city, once again, we go through another review and consent process. And each of these take a month or two at least to do for us to review all the information at all levels of our organization. And then the final review is before we convert to a formal ground lease for 60 to 90 years, one last review of everything. But once we're already, as I use the metaphor, like Linda was talking about baking and I use marriage, once we move from engagement to marriage, we're in the engagement period, we're kind of assuming it's going to happen. And the only thing that would throw that off is if financing falls apart or something major changes in the entitlement process that thwarts the project. We're kind of counting on it happening. So the front end is very loaded with lots of checks and balances, which can feel slow for everyone involved. The benefit is there's a lot of buy-in. And then once we get into the development phase of fundraising and entitlements and the construction, it's kind of moving along and we're just looking forward to celebrating it when it's done. Does that answer, Deddy, the questions you were asking?
Yeah, that's great. And I understand that different church organizations or faith organizations are going to have different structure, but probably the process is going to be very similar in each of those. So we have some questions here, and I want to get into those. Question, what does the community outreach process generally look like, and how do you interface with the surrounding community and the congregation? And I'm going to toss that one to Sarah. We touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, I think I might kind of share a recent experience that we had in the city of Claremont, which is an affluent city in the San Gabriel Valley. They've had some challenges with trying to develop affordable housing in that community. And Reverend Jesse with St. Ambrose Episcopal Church came to National Core, and they ended up selecting us kind of through a request for qualifications process. And we knew that we were going to need to really garner support for this project in order for it to be successful. And so we actually literally put together a document outlining the different steps that we were going to take to kind of start garnering that support. So, as I mentioned, the first step in our minds is to really make sure that the church, we kind of start by talking to church leadership. Some churches decide to go ahead and put together a housing committee, and they, assign people that they feel like in their congregation have expertise that would be valuable to provide input. So we really kind of work closely with the congregation and the leadership first to make sure that what we're designing and what, that everybody's vision is aligned. And then we kind of start going out to the larger community. So with Claremont, we really started small by talking to a lot of the local housing support groups, Housing Claremont, Inclusive Claremont, the Interfaith Council, and meeting one-on-one over Zoom or in person with those individuals. We also kept, we let the council members know one-on-one about what we were working on. We really tried to kind of make sure that the information was starting to get out there in a controlled way so that we could make sure that people were getting the correct information. And once we felt like we had kind of built up a strong base, we scheduled a community meeting that was open to the public. We mailed notices, and we ended up doing a door knocking campaign around the neighborhood to make sure that the immediate neighbors were very aware that the meeting was happening, because we really wanted to make sure that they could attend and would have the opportunity to provide input and ask their questions. And from there, we continue to talk, update people. Our community meeting in Claremont went really well. It was generally very positive, and we did not have, there were previous meetings in the city on other developments that were pretty controversial. So we were very pleased that our meeting went very smoothly. So we'll continue to work with them. We are just submitted for entitlements in Claremont. So if we need to have another meeting, we will, but we just kind of keep going with it, making sure that people are updated. But that's kind of a typical process, I would say, to just kind of starting out as part of those early on phases.
Yeah, and I think that approach is typically very successful. In the case of Angelina, I might add, we did, as you can imagine, through the design process that stretches out over several years. There are lots of iterations and changes that happen, but we actually had some 3-story elements in our development, but very late in the game, we had a neighborhood opposition arise that didn't like the 3 stories. And so everyone had to kind of compromise a little bit in order to, get through that process. We kind of reverted to a 2-story structure for both of the buildings on the site, which meant that it had to spread out a little bit more on the land surface, which was a compromise the church, agreed to. And then we may have lost 1 or 2 units or something in the process as well. So that can happen, but I think when you, as Sarah mentioned, when you reach out early to the community and start to get that input, you'll get a feel for what might come up later as well.
Well, we kind of took lessons learned from Placentia, and when we went to go design Claremont, we purposely made sure that the element facing the street was 2 stories, the one that kind of interfaced with residential that was adjacent, so that it maybe feels a little bit less, less of a presence on the street frontage. So yeah,
and that's typical in more suburban communities like Claremont and Placentia, et cetera. So I see another question here. I'm not sure who's going to be best to answer, so I'm going to ask for a volunteer. What are the property tax implications of developing housing on church properties?
I'll take a whack at that initially, and I'll combine it with another question. It looks like a participant named Elsa has asked, which is about mixed use projects. Yeah. So not a tax specialist. I'm not giving legal tax advice for any churches. That's my disclosure. You need to talk with people who are managing that for you, because it can get a little complicated. But generally, in principle, if your use of the land under a ground lease is for consistent nonprofit community benefit work, the ground lease income doesn't encumber unrelated business income tax implications the same way a nonprofit, a for-profit enterprise would. So even in a mixed use case, if all of the uses are generally charitable nonprofit community benefit, there's an argument to be made that it's not unrelated business income, and therefore it's not throwing off your current tax status. I can't speak to the housing portion. I'll leave that to CORE, but in our cases, the agreement is the developer takes on any tax implications of the leasehold interest for the housing development. That's not impacting the church. Where we as church are interested is income coming off the lease. Is that taxable? And it's riskier when you do mixed use. It's less risky when you do 100% affordable housing. That's my general answer.
Yeah, that's good. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah,
to
I
that?
would just add to that, that this can be, I mean, it may be why some organizations have looked to partner with affordable housing, like nonprofits, is because we do qualify for a tax exemption. And so it makes it a little bit cleaner in that regard. So something to kind of keep in mind too, that's come up with kind of just the legal and the tax aspect is it does get interesting in terms of the way that sites are laid out. So it is a little bit easier when you have kind of a separate area that the housing can kind of go versus our Placentia project where it's literally buildings on either side. So just, again, it doesn't mean that it's not possible. It just is a little bit cleaner in terms of lending and kind of for tax purposes.
Yeah, very necessary. I don't know, with respect to the mixed use, we have not done that on one of these properties, but I can imagine in a much more urban setting, that might be a possibility where that could happen.
We actually, in our Santa Ana in Legacy Square, it is it's a TOD, a transit-oriented development, and it does have a small component on the ground floor that is non-residential. So in that instance, the church was consolidating their campuses, and so there is not really any religious uses occurring on site any longer. So the housing, it's mostly affordable housing, and then there's a very small component. For National Core, we don't tend to do a ton of mixed use just because we see ourselves more as a residential. It can be complicated to manage commercial spaces. So we tend to try to focus on residential. Maybe we'll have a small component, but it's usually like very small, like a couple, at the most, like a couple thousand square feet. So we try to activate the ground floor through like our community room and offices and other kind of the other like non-residential uses that are key that we still have to provide for residents to operate.
And in a case, we haven't executed one yet, but we have two different cases that are looking at, I guess you'd call it mixed use for the non-residential, but they're aligned with the mission. One is community space to continue with 12-step programs and court mandated anger management and that sort of thing. And in the other case, it's an interesting, they're wanting to do it integrated, but a different landhold interest for a community health clinic that would serve the residents of the housing development and others in the community. I don't know that it will quite work out, but for us, we're always trying to find alignment so that it's not, the non-housing portion is still consistent with the mission and ministry of the church and the community.
Yeah, I would say the same for National Core. That's exactly what we do as well.
All right.
The last thing I wanted to add, oh, sorry, I know there's a lot of questions. Last thing I wanted to add is there are provisions within SB4 that do allow for mixed use. There are limitations such as it has to be on the bottom floor and certain regulatory requirements within the existing local agency, but just wanted to put that out there that is, there are provisions for that in SB4.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Important. Well, the next question is, are there any restrictions on funding sources relative to the involvement of religious organizations in the ownership profile? So again, I'm not sure here, but either Reverend Bell or Sarah probably.
Yeah, so again, this is newer. So it's kind of interesting, for example, on our Santa Ana, on our Legacy Square development with the United Methodist Church, it was one of the first ones that we've completed and done a permanent conversion for financing. And so it's been very interesting. We have all this legislation that's been passed by the governor and is coming down, but then we have the agencies up at the state that are actually implementing different things. And it's not that they're not aligned, but I think there's still a lot of issues that are having to be kind of worked out. So the short answer is I would say yes. I mean, generally public funding sources are pretty particular about separation of church and state. I know that it's very common. For example, we've gotten asked many times by different faith-based groups that we've talked to about whether they can have a unit, for example, or whether they can use the community room. And both of those are very different situations and there's different answers to those. For example, with a unit, if if the easiest thing is to not. If we did, we would not be allowed to finance it with public money. So it would have to be excluded from the basis, and it does make things just a lot more complicated. So generally for us, we've been, we also have to adhere to fair housing in our building. So there's just a lot of layers to it. And it generally, we've been keeping the affordable housing separate from religious uses. Now, when it comes to using the community room for different programming, that's something that maybe has a little bit more discretion. I think, again, like Reverend Bell was mentioning, there's certain programs that may make sense to provide to residents, but generally the separation of church and state is very important to the state of California, we have learned, and we've actually had to adjust some of our kind of at the end, some of our I don't want to overcomplicate it, but we've had to kind of adjust the cost because we had like a small office that the church was going to use, for example. So
from a practical church side of things, what I'm instructing our newer projects that are asking these questions is, as Sarah said, we want to make the distinction between the religious function property and the housing property as clear as possible. So for instance, we don't commingle a contract for landscaping, or if you want to quote unquote spend some of the money to do something church related, try to negotiate that early as an upfront capital advance of the lease payments, so that it's not considered part of the housing project per se. From the housing side, they simply tell their funding sources, this was part of the land acquisition and use cost. We had to pay $500,000 or $1 million, and what the church did with that, we have no idea, but this was part of our acquisition costs. Once things are operating, they need to remain pretty distinct also. So I try to help our churches know that. If a church chooses to venture into this as a venture partner, which we're not choosing to do, but that becomes even yet more complex because the church itself might be one of the investment partners in the capital stack. That requires some creative legal maneuvering, and we're not doing that currently. We're trying to reduce some of the complications and risk. Pardon, my cat has decided to join our room. It was this or a lot of scratches on the leg.
Great. Well, we have one final question, which is, what are common areas of pushback in the community engagement process that you have experienced, if any? And by the way, that's a picture of the groundbreaking at Angelina that happened on Monday. Looks like a lot of happy people there.
yeah, and you have Bishop John Taylor there, who's been a great proponent of, we've worked closely with him. He's even come to the city council meetings during COVID to help push some of these projects through, which hopefully SB4 will now alleviate some of that. But oh my goodness, with the pushback from the community, again, I think it's kind of twofold. I mean, it's really, the physical like aspect of having this new use and this new building in the neighborhood. So, height is a key thing that people are very concerned about. I mean, we tend to really limit to, no higher than 3 stories. Where we can do 2-story elements, we do. Parking and circulation or traffic, a lot of, so far, our church partnership projects where the church has remained and we're building on land adjacent to an operational church, we have done senior housing. And so the parking demand is a little bit lower than for families. We're kind of thinking about that target population and what makes sense with the existing use. But with community engagement, honestly, kind of sadly, what we're hearing a lot is, with adding permanent supportive housing, and people have said some of the most horrible things about the types of people that they are envisioning living there, and that they're going to just completely destroy their community and neighborhood. So kind of combating and, humanizing, letting them, it's not that this is just a free for all. There's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of, different layers. There's property management. There's all these people kind of overseeing this, and everybody wants it to be successful. So just that educational piece, it takes a while. It can take a long time to get a community on board. And that's why we start our outreach process very early, to start talking to people and let them know, And again, it helps when the faith-based organization is kind of leading that effort to say, this is our land and this is what we see as being kind of a key vision and how we want to give back.
And from a church perspective, a couple of things. It's important to pastorally listen for factual material concerns, property value issues, legitimate traffic concerns versus fears and phobias and biases. And you address those in different ways. And one of the best ways to address a lot of them is to invite people, if they're willing, to go visit other communities already in operation and talk to the neighbors of those communities to dispel some of the phobias and fears. But you have to qualify if a person's even on the fence or not. If they're just not interested in those people being near me, it's hard to convince someone to change their heart and mind that way. Luckily, most people are in that mushy middle. They just need to have their fears and phobias addressed and concerned and allied. Our experience so far is some of those toughest opponents become almost advocates by the end, like, wow, this is so not what I feared. This is actually so much better than what I imagined. And they can then become advocates going forward. But we're churches, we're faith leaders. You've got to listen pastorally first and try to understand what the real concerns are. Address facts differently than the hot emotional triggers.
Yeah, I can remember in Angelina, in the case of Angelina again, that there was a time when we really got into who are the people, who are the residents, and it came out that we were going to, or that CORE was going to house some supportive housing and some veterans, et cetera, homeless veterans. And we had a meeting, and I was so touched and moved when some of the congregation told anecdotal stories about experiences they had themselves and about people they knew. And it was after that meeting that the church really embraced the population that was going to be housed in this complex. And then, of course, with the tremendous management expertise that National CORE brings to the table, and the way in which they deal with issues or anything that can come up, really the end result is exemplary affordable housing projects. It's really great to see. So that kind of concludes our webinar. And I have to say this was really great. I loved hearing everyone's presentation. I don't know if there's anyone who wants to make a final comment or anything. You're more than welcome to. But I think you all did a great, fantastic job, and I hope that those who participated, will consider taking this back to their own communities, et cetera, and encouraging the faith-based communities that they may be involved with to pursue this if they have excess land and opportunity to do so. So, and then finally, if you have any other questions or anything like that, by all means, please send me an email. I will forward them to the appropriate person to answer them, and we will definitely get back to you with any additional information you may be interested in knowing. So again, thank you everyone for participating, and thank you panelists for doing such a stellar, amazing job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.